Imagine this for a moment. You wake up in the morning, reach for your phone, scroll through the endless flood of images and headlines, and something inside whispers, "I need more success, more money, more recognition, more something." And yet, despite everything you already have, the roof above you, the food in your fridge, the people who care about you, your heart still feels restless, empty. This is the silent hunger of our age. We live in an era of abundance, yet our souls often feel impoverished. We mistake possessions for fulfillment, achievements for meaning, and recognition for love. But deep down, the ache remains. Now, here's the hidden truth. Abundance is not measured by how much you hold in your hands, but by how deeply you appreciate what you already have. Gratitude is the key that unlocks this truth. When your heart is grateful, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. A glass of water feels like a miracle. A smile from a stranger feels like sunlight. Even the smallest moment, like the wind touching your skin, reminds you that life itself is a blessing. Gratitude is not just a polite thank you. It is a way of seeing, a way of being. It shifts the focus from what is missing to what is present, from scarcity to abundance. It doesn't mean you stop striving or dreaming. It means you stop living in lack. The Buddha once said, "A noble person is grateful and thankful." In his time, gratitude was not a decoration for the spiritual path. It was the foundation. A grateful heart is fertile ground where peace, compassion, and wisdom can grow. Think about this. When was the last time you paused and truly felt gratitude, not just for something big like a promotion or a gift, but for something small, the breath moving in and out of your lungs, the taste of warm tea, the fact that the earth beneath you quietly carries your weight without asking for anything in return? So often we move through life blind to these silent blessings. We rush, we complain, we compare. And in doing so, we close the very door that leads to joy. But when gratitude awakens, everything changes. Your perception sharpens. You stop taking things for granted. Suddenly, the ordinary moments you once overlooked glow with quiet beauty. Gratitude turns a simple home into a palace, a modest meal into a feast, and an ordinary day into a sacred gift. Psychologists today confirm what sages knew for centuries. Gratitude rewires the brain. It lowers stress, increases happiness, and strengthens relationships. But even beyond science, gratitude has a mystical quality. It attracts blessings in ways logic cannot explain. A grateful heart seems to open invisible doors, as if the universe itself responds to your thankfulness. Have you ever noticed? The people who radiate joy are not always the richest, the most powerful, or the most celebrated. More often, they are the ones who live with gratitude. Their hearts shine not because life gave them more, but because they learned to see more in what life already gave. This is why gratitude matters. It is not optional, it is the doorway. Without it, no amount of wealth or success can bring lasting fulfillment. With it, even the simplest life overflows with abundance. So let this be the invitation. As we walk together through these reflections, step into that doorway. Open your heart to gratitude, not as a ritual, not as a forced habit, but as a way of living. Because when gratitude fills your heart, 1,000 blessings follow. Gratitude may seem like a soft, gentle feeling, but hidden within it is a power strong enough to reshape a human life. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It works quietly like roots beneath the soil, holding the whole tree steady. And yet without it, even the strongest tree will eventually fall. Think of a time when anger consumed you, when your mind replayed harsh words or unfair treatment over and over again. In that storm, peace felt impossible, didn't it? But here's the secret. The moment gratitude enters, anger begins to dissolve. Why? Because gratitude shifts the lens. It reminds you that beyond the hurt there is still kindness, still love, still reasons to be thankful. It softens the edges of pain. Gratitude is an antidote to craving too. Desire whispers, "You're not enough, you don't have enough, you need more." But gratitude answers, "I already have more than I realize. I am alive, I am breathing, I am supported by countless unseen hands." Suddenly, craving loses its grip. And when it comes to fear, those nights when worry steals your sleep, Gratitude again shows its power. Instead of spiraling into what-ifs, gratitude grounds you in what is. It reminds you that in this moment you are safe, breathing, alive. That clarity becomes a lamp in the darkness. In Buddhist teachings, gratitude is not separate from wisdom. To be grateful is to recognize interdependence, the truth that nothing exists by itself. Your life is woven from countless threads. The air you breathe, the food you eat, the teachers who guided you, the strangers who built the roads you walk on. Gratitude is the awareness of this web, and when you see it clearly, arrogance fades, humility grows, and compassion blossoms. Think of a candle flame. Alone, it is small, but in the dark, it has the power to transform an entire room. Gratitude works in the same way. Even a little gratitude can light up the shadows of the mind. There is a story told in Zen tradition of a monk who had only one robe and one bowl. A visitor asked, "Don't you feel poor with so little?" The monk smiled and said, "Poor? I have everything I need, the sun to warm me, the earth to support me, the Dharma to guide me. What more could I ask for?" In his gratitude, he lived richer than kings. This is the hidden power of gratitude. It doesn't just make you feel good, it frees you. Free from endless comparison, free from dissatisfaction, free from the heavy weight of always wanting more. Gratitude opens the heart to contentment, and in that contentment, true joy awakens. And here's the paradox. When you live with gratitude, you actually receive more. Not because the universe magically drops gold into your lap, but because your perception changes. What you once overlooked, you now treasure. What you once dismissed, you now celebrate. Your world expands not outward, but inward. Imagine how different life feels when every sip of water, every shared laugh, every breath of fresh air is seen as a gift. That is abundance. That is freedom. Gratitude, then, is not weakness. It is strength. The quiet kind of strength that carries you through suffering, that deepens your wisdom, and that makes your heart unshakable. And as we continue this journey, we'll begin to see how this power isn't just personal. It has been taught, remembered, and lived through countless stories that still echo today. When wisdom is too vast to grasp with words, stories become the bridge. They travel across time, carrying truths in simple images, so even a child can understand what sages spend lifetimes uncovering. And when it comes to gratitude, Buddhist stories speak with a power that logic alone cannot. One such story begins with the Buddha himself, not in his final glory as the enlightened one, but in his earlier lives, recorded in the Jataka tales. There was once a time when he was born as a little monkey. One day he saw a thirsty traveler collapse under the blazing sun. The monkey climbed a tall tree, picked fruit, and brought it to the man. But when the man recovered, greed took over his heart. Instead of thanking the monkey, he tried to kill it, thinking, "If I can catch this creature, I'll have food for days." The monkey escaped with wounds, but the story didn't end with anger. Even in pain, he whispered, "Though he harmed me, I gave out of compassion. Gratitude is his loss, not mine." Centuries later, that lesson would mature into the Buddha's teaching, that gratitude protects the giver more than the receiver. To give with a grateful heart is never wasted, even if others fail to see it. Another story tells of the Buddha's deep reverence for his own mother. After attaining enlightenment, he realized his mother had passed away and been reborn in a heavenly realm. Out of boundless gratitude, he ascended to teach her the Dharma, guiding her toward liberation. This was not obligation, it was recognition. He understood that even enlightenment itself stood upon the foundation of a mother's love. Gratitude in this way is not small, it reaches across worlds. And then there is the tale of a humble disciple named Maudgalyayana, one of the Buddha's closest followers. He discovered that his mother had been reborn in a realm of suffering because of her greed. Out of gratitude and love, he used his spiritual powers to offer food to her, but it turned to flames in her hands. The Buddha advised him to offer instead through the Sangha, dedicating merit to his mother. In this act, Maudgalyayana not only freed her, but also gave birth to the tradition of Ulambana, an annual reminder to honor and repay the kindness of parents and ancestors. Gratitude here became more than personal. It became a collective practice of remembrance. These stories are not dusty relics of the past. They are mirrors. The monkey reminds us that gratitude should flow from our own hearts, even if the world doesn't always return it. The Buddha's journey to his mother shows us that gratitude transcends even life and death. And Maudgalyayana's devotion proves that gratitude, when expressed, has the power to liberate not just ourselves, but those we love most deeply. Notice how these stories weave a common thread. Gratitude is never passive. It is action, devotion, remembrance. It turns love into movement. It turns kindness into liberation. And perhaps this is why we still tell these tales thousands of years later, because in them we find ourselves. Who among us has not been unthanked for a kindness? Who among us has not owed a debt to a mother, a father, a teacher, or a friend? Who among us does not long to repay love in some way? Gratitude, as these stories reveal, is not a fragile feeling. It is a force. One that binds generations. One that heals wounds. One that ensures the Dharma itself is never forgotten. And as these ancient tales fade back into silence, the question arises, what about our modern world? What does today's wisdom say about gratitude? Strangely enough, science itself is beginning to echo what these stories have always known. The ancient stories whisper timeless truths, but today, even the language of science has begun to agree. It is almost as if modern research is rediscovering what the Buddha and countless sages taught centuries ago. Gratitude is medicine for the heart, for the mind, and even for the body. Psychologists call gratitude one of the most powerful, positive emotions. But unlike fleeting happiness, gratitude has a lasting effect. It reshapes the brain. Neuroscientists found that when you practice gratitude, certain regions of the brain light up, areas linked to empathy, motivation, and joy. It's as if gratitude rewires your mind to see abundance where others see lack. One study asked people to write down 3 things they were grateful for each day. After only a few weeks, participants reported higher levels of happiness and lower levels of depression. Their sleep improved. Their relationships deepened. Stress hormones dropped. A simple practice, just noticing blessings, had the power to transform their entire well-being. And it goes further. Doctors discovered that gratitude strengthens the immune system. People who cultivate gratitude recover faster from illness, handle pain better, and even live longer. It seems almost miraculous, yet it is not magic. It is alignment. Gratitude reduces the inner tension of constant dissatisfaction, freeing the body to heal, to rest, to thrive. Think about the opposite for a moment. A life without gratitude feels heavy. Anxiety rises. The mind fixates on what is missing. Stress becomes chronic. Over time, this state of lack corrodes not just the spirit but the body. Modern science now shows what Buddhism always hinted at. The mind and body are not separate. A restless heart brings suffering. A grateful one brings harmony. But science, in its own way, is catching up to something deeper. Gratitude doesn't just improve health, it deepens connection. Studies show that when people express gratitude, relationships grow stronger. Couples who thank each other more often feel more satisfied. Teams that practice gratitude work more effectively. Communities built on gratitude become resilient. Isn't that what Buddhist teachings have always said? That gratitude opens the heart, and from that open heart flows compassion, patience, and kindness. When you are grateful, you don't just see yourself, you see the other. You recognize the invisible web of support that makes life possible, and you respond with humility instead of pride, with cooperation instead of conflict. And here lies the beauty. Gratitude is contagious. Scientists observe that when one person expresses gratitude, those around them feel uplifted, inspired to give and to care. It's like a ripple that spreads outward, touching lives you may never even meet. So whether you listen to the words of a monk under a Bodhi tree or read the charts of a neuroscientist in a lab, the message is the same. Gratitude is transformative. It quiets the restless mind, strengthens the fragile body, and awakens the sleeping heart. In a world obsessed with what can be measured, it's almost poetic that the immeasurable, gratitude, has become measurable, and yet still points beyond numbers. For while brain scans can reveal patterns, they cannot capture the radiance of a heart that sees blessings in every breath. And this leads us deeper into the heart of Buddhist thought. Gratitude is not only a state of mind, it is karma in motion. Every thankful thought, every act of appreciation, plants seeds that shape the future. To understand this is to step beyond science and into the timeless law of cause and effect. Science shows us the benefits of gratitude in the body and mind, but Buddhism invites us to see even further, to the invisible threads of cause and effect that stretch beyond a single lifetime. This is the realm of karma, and here, gratitude reveals its deepest power. Karma is often misunderstood as fate, as though life is a rigid script we cannot change. But in the Buddha's teaching, karma simply means action. Every thought, every word, every deed planting seeds that will eventually bear fruit. Gratitude, then, is not just an emotion. It is an action of the heart. Each moment of thankfulness plants wholesome seeds that ripen into peace, kindness, and joy. Think of it this way. When you feel grateful toward your parents, your teachers, or even strangers who have helped you, that gratitude naturally inspires action. You smile, you give back, you care. These actions ripple outward, touching others, and sooner or later those ripples return. This is karma, cause meeting effect, gratitude blossoming into blessings. The Buddha once reminded his disciples that the debt to one's parents is immeasurable. Even if you carried your mother on one shoulder and your father on the other for 100 years, feeding them, bathing them, serving them, you would still not repay the depth of their kindness. But by living with gratitude, by practicing the Dharma, you honor them in the truest way. Gratitude itself becomes a karmic bridge, connecting generations, ensuring that love is never lost. Ungratefulness, on the other hand, plants a very different seed. A mind that constantly complains, that forgets kindness, that lives entitled. Such a mind feeds the karma of suffering. It closes the heart, and in doing so, it closes the door to blessings. Like a field left barren, nothing wholesome can grow there. There is an old story of a farmer who received water for his crops from the kindness of a neighbor upstream. Instead of gratitude, he grew jealous, thinking, "Why does he control the flow of water? Why not me?" His envy poisoned his heart. He quarreled, destroyed the channels, and in the end, both fields withered. Gratitude would have given him harmony, but ungratefulness gave him ruin. When we understand karma, we see gratitude differently. It is not just a fleeting feeling. It is a force that shapes destiny. To be grateful is to align with harmony. To be ungrateful is to align with discord. And every choice plants a seed. But here is the beauty. Even if we have lived years forgetting gratitude, the moment we awaken it, karma shifts. A single act of genuine thankfulness can change the direction of a life. Like turning a ship at sea, it may not happen instantly, but slowly, steadily, the course transforms. Gratitude, then, is not only about repaying the past, it is about creating the future. Every bow of thankfulness, every word of appreciation, every silent recognition of kindness builds conditions for peace yet to come. And so, as karma unfolds, gratitude becomes more than a personal practice. It becomes a path, a way of walking through the world with humility, reverence, and wisdom. And when gratitude is absent, we begin to see how easily the heart closes, how quickly blessings slip through our fingers. This is where we must look deeper, not only at the beauty of gratitude, but at the shadow of its opposite. Because when gratitude is missing, something precious is lost. And that blindness, too, has consequences. If gratitude is a doorway that opens us to abundance, then ungratefulness is the lock that keeps it shut. Nothing drains the spirit faster than a heart that refuses to recognize its blessings. Ungratefulness is subtle. It often doesn't appear as loud anger or open rejection. It appears as restlessness, as constant dissatisfaction, as the whisper that says, "This is not enough." And when that whisper becomes the soundtrack of a life, joy has no room to enter. Imagine holding a glass of pure, clean water. If you are grateful, you see life itself reflected in that glass. You drink and you feel nourished. But if you are ungrateful, you complain, why only water, why not wine, why not more? In that moment, the blessing in your hands turns invisible. What should have been abundance becomes lack. This is why ungratefulness blocks blessings, not because blessings disappear, but because the eyes no longer see them. The heart becomes blind. In Buddhist teaching, craving is one of the deepest roots of suffering, and craving is simply ungratefulness wearing a disguise. To crave is to say, what I have is not enough, I must have more. But no matter how much arrives, the hunger remains. This endless thirst keeps the mind trapped, never satisfied, never free. Ungratefulness also poisons relationships. A child who forgets the kindness of parents grows cold and distant. A friend who never says thank you slowly loses trust. A partner who only sees flaws erodes love. In every case, the bond weakens, not because blessings were absent, but because they went unacknowledged. There is a story of a king who had everything, wealth, power, servants, but who never felt content. Every day he complained, his food was not seasoned enough, his bed not soft enough, his court not loyal enough. The more he demanded, the emptier he felt. One day he met a beggar who smiled while eating a crust of bread. Astonished, the king asked, "How can you be happy with so little?" The beggar replied, "Because I give thanks for every bite. Gratitude makes even little things feel like treasures. You, my king, live in a palace but dwell in poverty. I live in poverty but dwell in a palace." The king's story is our story. Whenever ungratefulness rules the mind, no amount of wealth, comfort, or recognition will ever feel like enough. We can sit in a palace yet feel poor. Ungratefulness also blocks blessings through karma. When someone receives kindness but responds with entitlement or complaint, the natural flow of giving stops. People withdraw. Opportunities close. The karmic seeds of ingratitude bear bitter fruit, isolating the person further. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of ungratefulness is this: it cuts us off from wonder. Life itself is miraculous. The rising of the sun, the beating of the heart, the breath that moves in and out without effort. When gratitude is absent, all of this becomes ordinary, dull, unseen. The sacred hides in plain sight, and yet the lock of ungratefulness can be opened. The very moment we choose to notice even the smallest gift, the blindness begins to lift. A single breath of gratitude can transform complaint into contentment, scarcity into sufficiency, heaviness into lightness. Ungratefulness blocks blessings, but gratitude restores them. The choice in each moment belongs to us, and if we truly want to live differently, gratitude must move beyond a thought. It must become a way of life, a practice woven into the fabric of our days, turning even the simplest acts into sacred rituals. Gratitude is not meant to live only in lofty words or sacred scriptures. Its true power unfolds in the small moments, the everyday choices, the hidden corners of an ordinary life. To practice gratitude is to weave a thread of gold through the fabric of each day, until the whole of life shines differently. But how do we do this? How do we bring gratitude down from the clouds and root it into our daily rhythm? The answer lies in practice, simple, mindful habits that transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. Begin with the morning. Before your feet even touch the ground, pause, take a single breath and whisper silently to yourself, "I woke up. I am alive. This day is a gift." Instead of rushing into the flood of emails, tasks, and noise, start with thanks. This single pause shifts the entire tone of the day. At meals, turn eating into a ritual of gratitude. Look at the food before you and remember, countless lives contributed to this moment. The farmers who grew the grains, the rain that nourished the soil, the hands that prepared the dish. Each bite is not just nutrition, it is a miracle. A simple thank you before eating transforms hunger into reverence. Gratitude also grows when we learn to notice the unnoticed. The person who holds the door open, the bus driver who carries us safely, the teacher who explains patiently, the friend who sends a message at just the right time. Each of these is easy to overlook, but when acknowledged, they become treasures. A smile, a nod, a kind word in return, these are seeds of gratitude that ripple outward. Another practice is keeping a gratitude journal. Each night, write down 3 things you are thankful for. They don't have to be grand. In fact, the smaller the better. The sound of rain against the window, the warmth of a blanket, a moment of laughter that softened the day. Over time, this practice retrains the mind. Instead of scanning for what is missing, the mind learns to see what is already here. And don't forget the power of spoken gratitude. Words have weight. To say thank you sincerely can heal wounds, mend distance, and strengthen love. Tell your parents you appreciate their sacrifices. Tell your partner you notice their kindness. Tell your friend you're grateful for their presence. Do not wait for tomorrow. Gratitude delayed is often gratitude lost. In Buddhism, there is also the practice of dedicating merit. After meditation, prayer, or any act of goodness, practitioners silently offer the benefit to others, to parents, to teachers, to strangers, to all beings. This is gratitude in its highest form, not only recognizing kindness received, but paying it forward so the circle of blessings never ends. Some might say, but what about difficult days? What about suffering? And this is where gratitude becomes most transformative. To give thanks not only for what is pleasant, but even for challenges is to awaken true wisdom. The setback that taught patience, the heartbreak that deepened compassion, the failure that revealed humility, all of these too can be met with gratitude. They are not punishments but teachers. Practicing gratitude daily does not mean ignoring pain. It means widening the view. Even in the storm, there is still air to breathe, still lessons to learn, still reasons to bow the head in thanks. Gratitude does not deny suffering, it transforms it. When gratitude becomes a habit, life changes. Complaints soften, comparisons fade. What once felt ordinary begins to glow. Gratitude turns days into gifts, people into teachers, and the present moment into sacred ground. This is how life is transformed, not by chasing more, but by seeing more. Not by adding to our load, but by awakening to the blessings already in our hands. And yet, the truest test of gratitude is not in moments of ease, but in moments of trial. To remain grateful when life hurts. This is where gratitude reveals its deepest strength. It is easy to feel grateful when life is smooth, when health is steady, when relationships are kind, when success arrives at the door. But the real question is this: can gratitude survive the storm? This is where the heart is tested. This is where gratitude reveals whether it is just a fragile mood or a deep foundation. Buddhism teaches us that suffering is not a mistake in life. It is a universal truth. The Buddha's very first teaching, the Four Noble Truths, begins with this recognition. Life includes dukkha, stress, dissatisfaction, pain. To deny it is to remain asleep. To face it with courage is to begin waking up. But how can one be thankful in the middle of heartbreak, in the silence of loss, in the grip of illness? Gratitude here is not about pretending the pain is pleasant. It is about seeing through the pain into what it teaches. Think of the lotus. Its beauty is unmatched, but it blooms only in muddy waters. Without the mud, there is no flower. In the same way, suffering is the soil where wisdom and compassion grow. And for that, even pain can be honored. There are stories of prisoners of war who, in the darkest cells, learned to cherish a single beam of light through a crack in the wall. There are patients who, in the face of terminal illness, discovered a deeper appreciation for the present moment than they ever had in times of health. Suffering stripped away illusions and gratitude arose, not for the pain itself, but for the clarity it brought. In Buddhist practice, gratitude in suffering is often expressed as thank you for the teaching. When betrayal shatters trust, one learns resilience. When loss breaks the heart, one learns impermanence. When obstacles block the path, one learns patience. The wound becomes the doorway. The scar becomes the scripture. This does not mean forcing a smile or denying grief. To be grateful in suffering does not mean to avoid tears. It means to cry with awareness, to know even tears are proof of a heart that still loves, still feels. Gratitude allows us to embrace the whole of life, not just the sweet parts. A monk once said, "The hardest people in your life are your greatest teachers. They reveal where your compassion ends and where it must grow." Gratitude for these teachers is not easy, but it is liberating. Instead of being trapped in resentment, one can bow and say, "You too are part of my awakening." The practice is simple but not easy. In suffering, ask quietly, "What is this moment teaching me?" At first, the answers may not come, but over time, the heart softens. Pain no longer feels meaningless. Gratitude emerges not as denial but as understanding. And here lies the paradox. The very moments we wish had never happened often become the ones that shape us most deeply. They strip away pride. They expose our vulnerability. They connect us to the suffering of others. They make us human in the fullest sense. So even in suffering, gratitude whispers, "Thank you for this chance to grow. Thank you for reminding me of what is real. Thank you for showing me that even in darkness there can be light." When gratitude enters suffering, suffering itself begins to change. It no longer feels like punishment. It becomes a path. It no longer feels like the end. It becomes the ground of transformation. And this is where gratitude's power reaches its deepest depth. Not in sunshine, but in shadow. Not in comfort, but in crisis. It is here that the heart discovers a blessing that cannot be taken away. Gratitude never stops with the one who feels it. Like a stone dropped into still water, its energy ripples outward, touching lives we may never even see. A grateful heart is not just a blessing to the self, it is a blessing to the world. Think of the last time someone sincerely thanked you. Not a casual thanks, but a moment when their eyes softened, their voice carried warmth, and you felt seen. That moment lifted something inside you. It may have been small, but for a while, the burdens you carried felt lighter. That is the quiet power of gratitude. It heals not only the giver, but also the receiver. When gratitude is expressed, it transforms relationships. Families that practice thankfulness grow closer. Children who hear words of appreciation learn to value kindness over entitlement. Partners who thank each other often discover that love doesn't fade with time, it deepens. Gratitude becomes the glue that binds hearts together. Communities, too, change under its influence. A workplace where gratitude flows is not just a place of labor. It becomes a place of cooperation, of support, of shared purpose. A society where gratitude is honored is less harsh, less divided. People look at one another not as competitors, but as companions. In Buddhism, there is the beautiful teaching of interbeing, the understanding that all lives are interconnected. Gratitude is what makes this truth visible. When you feel thankful to the tree for giving you shade, to the river for quenching your thirst, to the stranger for offering kindness, you begin to see. Your life is not separate, it is woven into the fabric of countless others. Gratitude awakens us to the truth of our interdependence. And what happens when one person lives with such awareness? It inspires others. Gratitude is contagious. One act of appreciation can spark another. A thank you spoken aloud might encourage a stranger to be kinder to the next person they meet. The ripple continues, often beyond what the eye can trace. There are stories of entire villages transformed simply because a few individuals chose to live with gratitude. A monk once entered a war-torn community where bitterness had hardened hearts. Instead of preaching morality, he practiced gratitude, thanking farmers for their crops, children for their laughter, mothers for their strength. Slowly, the air of resentment shifted. The village began to soften. Gratitude became the seed from which peace grew. Even on a global scale, imagine what would happen if gratitude were cultivated widely. Environmental destruction would lessen, for gratitude to the earth leads to care. Violence would decrease, for gratitude to life leads to respect. Political conflict would soften, for gratitude to one another leads to dialogue. The ripple of a single grateful heart, multiplied, can heal entire nations. But the most powerful ripple of gratitude is perhaps invisible, the change in collective energy. When a grateful person enters a room, others feel it. There is a warmth, a presence, an openness that needs no words. Gratitude radiates and others are drawn into its orbit. This is why the Buddha often emphasized gratitude toward parents, teachers, and all beings. He understood that gratitude is not only personal, It is universal. To live with gratitude is to participate in a cycle of blessing that moves endlessly, like the wind carrying the fragrance of flowers across fields. So remember this: each thank you you speak, each moment of appreciation you feel is never small. It sets something in motion. It travels through people, through communities, through generations. The ripple of your grateful heart may one day return to you, magnified in ways you cannot imagine. And when gratitude flows freely, the 1,000 blessings it brings are not only yours, they belong to all. Life is fleeting. Moments slip away like sand through open hands. Yet within this impermanence lies a secret. The heart that learns to give thanks discovers a richness no loss can take away. Gratitude turns each moment, no matter how ordinary, into a blessing. We began with a simple truth: a grateful heart brings 1,000 blessings. And now, after this journey, the meaning has deepened. Gratitude is not just saying thank you. It is a way of seeing, a way of living, a way of awakening. It teaches us to honor the morning light, even if the night was long, to cherish the people who walk beside us, even knowing one day we must part, to bow to the teachers found not only in kind faces, but also in hardship and pain. Gratitude transforms the fleeting into the eternal by opening our eyes to the wonder already here. When gratitude fills the heart, the world is no longer divided into blessings and burdens. Everything becomes a gift. The laughter that lifts us, the sorrow that humbles us, the silence that holds us, the noise that tests us. Each one has its place in shaping who we are. A grateful life is not about possessing more, it is about perceiving more. It is not about chasing blessings, it is about awakening to the 1,000 blessings that already surround us. The air that enters our lungs, the earth that supports our steps, the love, the lessons, the very breath of this moment. And as gratitude flows, it does not stop at the self. It ripples outward, healing relationships, binding communities, softening the edges of a harsh world. A single grateful heart can ignite a chain of kindness that stretches farther than the eye can see. This is why the Buddha taught gratitude as a foundation of wisdom. Without it, the heart grows restless, always craving, always lacking. With it, the heart finds peace, contentment, and joy. Gratitude is not the destination, it is the path itself. So now, as this journey comes to a close, let us pause once more, place a hand over the heart, feel the breath rising and falling, and silently whisper, "Thank you. Thank you for this life, for this moment, for all that has been given, and even for what has been taken. For in gratitude, nothing is wasted, nothing is meaningless, everything is a blessing." A grateful heart truly brings 1,000 blessings. May yours be endless.